Hello and welcome to vBrownBag from vForum Australia 2018. My name's Brett Johnson and I'm going to do a bit of a quick presentation on explaining how the value of an API isn't necessarily that it's simply exposed, but the value comes from how you're going to consume that API. So a little bit of really quick about me. So I work as a senior consultant. My main focus of interest is around automation and particularly how to use automation to solve typical business problems, make things a bit easier, more consistent and overall less problematic. I blog at sdbrett.com and I'm on Twitter at brettjohnson008. So just to get started, I just want to go through a quick API 101. Just to sort of set a bit of context as to where this is going. So an API in general, it's not, it's a interface to an application. So it's a way you can programmatically interact with an application, whether it's make a modification, make a change, delete something, anything like that. And it is pretty much as the abbreviation says. So it enables external communication. So you might have an application where it internally talks between its functions and its modules in that application, but the API, when it's exposed, allows you to externally communicate it. You can see this sort of thing in for when, say, switches, the hardware ASICs on the switches. You can look at that as they have an API to consume that. So your switch vendors will have to use an API, perhaps from Brocade, to consume a Brocade ASIC. Oh, sorry, Broadcom, not Brocade. They've just been on my mind from a couple of recent conversations, so yeah, Broadcom. REST is a very popular one, especially when we're talking about automation, cloud-based services, DevOps, any of that sort of thing. REST is usually the common framework, but it's not the only way to do it. There are other ways. Drivers and such use different ways in where they're going to communicate, and that can be done by the vendor, a specific type of product, but REST is definitely not the only ones. Now, you get a high-level API, which is more around that way you would use REST. So if I was to interact with a cloud service, perhaps from AWS or Google, or another product such as Kubernetes, I'd use a high-level API to interact with that and make the changes. But at a lower level, perhaps drivers and hardware interaction, they're going to be a lower-level API. Now, to help illustrate my point about the value, I have an apple, which I'm hoping is confusing everybody right about now. So the value of an API, as the title says, is in the consumption. So if we look at it like this, I have an apple. It's sitting here in my hand, it's shiny. There's no value really to me in this apple. It doesn't keep doctors away, doesn't feed me, doesn't do anything. It's just going to sit here. If I stood here long enough, had the patience, it would just rot and be awful. So there's no value. Now, I should probably level set at the moment and say, this isn't to say you shouldn't get an application because this API, if it has an API, shouldn't be necessarily a buying decision if you're not going to be able to consume it. Just to set it, but having an API available may allow future consumption, have that potential to deliver value. But at the moment, like I said, like the apple, it has the potential, but it's not giving me any value at all. So now, just if I get an application, so say you got an application, it's got an API, what if you don't know how to consume it? How are you going to get value from that? So you give a baby an apple, a whole apple, and baby doesn't know what to do. It's probably just going to roll it off the table and cry because it's not milk. So it takes a while, and there's a maturing stage to here. After a little while, the baby starts to move to solids. You get an apple puree. Okay, we're gradually maturing in how we're actually going to consume this. As things go on, it gets harder, move to more solid foods. So you've got this learning curve from not knowing how to consume the API to taking those minimal steps to just consume it in a very fine sort of scope of how you're going to consume it. And as you mature, you can get more complex with how you're going to consume it. Then you might just have the apple by itself, or you might have an apple pie or an apple turnover, or strudel, or crumble, and I'm getting really distracted and hungry. So in essence, you take something like an API, if you don't know how to use it, that's okay. You might look at how you're going to learn to use it. What's a small way to start to use this API so it can deliver you value? But if it's sitting there not consumed, it's no good. It's not going to do anything for you. So when we look at the value of an API, where it can deliver value, the first thing is, what is your plan? You can't deliver, you can't just consume something because it's there. Like, how are you going to consume it? You need to plan. Is this an API that's going to help with monitoring, or is it going to help do some preventative remediation? What is your plan with this API? Do you have another orchestration engine that's going to consume it for you? There's a million different ways, but essentially you need that plan first of all. And then as part of that plan as well, or when you assess the product, what value are these to you? Like, how can that API itself do it? Now, this can come down to, again, your plan. It can be use cases that the vendor has provided. Now, as part of that, what's the ecosystem look like around that API being exposed? Does the vendor that you're buying the product from actually give you product already out of the box, or do they have some content packs or monitoring system that help expand it to consume the API of another product they sell? So you get a bit of a turnkey. Or if they don't, are they community things? Okay, the same as with monitoring, logging, packs to incorporate and ingest that data and make it usable. Is that something that is already available through community projects, third-party products, to consider that and give you some richness out of that data that comes through? With the ecosystem, it could be that the API is used to provide a CLI tool. Now that could be as an SDK, could be a straight CLI, it could be just a remote tool, maybe even a remote UI that goes through it, a web interface. So you need to look at what that ecosystem is actually going to look like when you get it and how you can incorporate that to it. Now, if you do decide that you're going to, the API has the potential for you to provide value based on your specific business needs, but they're not available from a ecosystem point of view or a turnkey point of view, what skills do you have in-house to actually monitor that and maintain that code that you might have to write yourself? Consuming APIs, while they say it's easy, putting the logic and the code behind it can be rather challenging. Now, also, what is the feature, and the final thing is, what does that feature cover look like? So if you've got we'll go with a backup product, and it's got an API that you can consume to say, did the backup pass, did it fail, how long it took, and general status of the backup, that's one thing. But what if that backup product's API doesn't have something where you could create a job, or interact with a job that's currently running, maybe to cancel it? What does that look like? These are the things that you might be able to do through a standard management console, or they could be things you do through another method. But is that available via the API? And if it's not, so you've got to understand that gap. So if your plan is to completely monitor, like incorporate you have a self-service portal for virtual machines, for example, and you've got a backup product that you want to integrate as part of that so users can manage that themselves, you need to look at what that feature coverage looks like, because if there's gaps there that they may actually be limiting for your end goal and for you to complete your plan. So there's a big reduction in value. Back to one of the original points, just to finish on, is if you got that product and you completely disregarded it, even if you didn't have a plan, but you decided, no, don't care about the API, we're going to go with something else, even though it doesn't have the API, you need to also consider that you may be limiting that ability to consume it later. So if you have a product, and sticking with backup, where they're normally the kind of products where you have for a long period of time, that may be limiting as well. So your plan should also have a sort of a roadmap area there as well, not just the immediate future. So I think that finishes it up. I went really quick on the slides. There we go. I am done. So yeah, I hope that's provided some information, and I hope you enjoyed this apple. And by the way, for those playing at home, this is a Jazz apple. Thank you.